Hi, I'm Tima, and
Hi, I'm Paul.
welcome to another episode of the aequi podcast. Today we're doing a special episode because, as you may or may not know, in the past few weeks, Nigerian youths all over the world have taken to the streets as part of the End SARS movement, protesting against police brutality, corruption, crimes against humanity, and bad government. So this weekend is actually an international call to action where End SARS protests will be taking place all over the world. So as a Nigerian youth myself, Paul and I thought that it would be important for us to use our platform to take part in this protest. So that's what we're going to do here today.
Yeah, and for this, we have chosen a bit of a different format than usual. So on the one hand, we are not just here by voice, but you can also see our faces. On the other hand, we're doing this live on YouTube. Maybe some of you are watching it right now. Plus, we have two special guests with us today that are experts in and could bring us more information on the protest and about the legal aspects of this. On the one hand, we have Gbenga, who is a journalist from Nigeria. He's a news anchor at News Central at TV Nigeria. Welcome, Gbenga, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Paul.
And we have Astrid with us today, who is a researcher at the Department of European, International and Comparative Law at the University of Vienna. And she's an expert in international law and especially international criminal law. Thank you for joining us too.
Thanks for the invitation.
So for those of you who are watching and listening who might not know what the End SARS movement is or have no idea what's going on in Nigeria and why it's so important, I think we should start there. So Gbenga, could you explain to everyone what this movement is about, how it started, and why it's so important?
Okay, SARS is an acronym for the abbreviation for Special Anti-Robbery Squad. It was created by the Nigerian government under the military rule of Ibrahim Babangida. In 1992, it was established to fight violent crimes and go after armed robberies. But since then, it has metamorphosized into, Amnesty International has documented their atrocities well. So they've been reports of extrajudicial killings, extortion, violence against ordinary citizens. And that's why people, young Nigerians, said enough is enough. They've raised issues against SARS in the past. And then the government comes and say, we've dissolved SARS, SARS doesn't exist anymore. And a few months down the line, when people move on, they're back on the streets. But this time around, it's very different because, it's a global phenomenon. The hashtag EndSARS went viral. It was trending worldwide, and it brought the attention of major international players and also celebrities to bring to the attention of the world the atrocities committed by EndSARS in order to end police brutality in Nigeria. So that's why the people are protesting, and the scores of testimonies that people have given, ordinary Nigerians, of the experiences in the hands of SARS, and it's not very palatable most times.
I think for me, the End SARS movement is so important because firstly, it's a youth-led movement. And I think as a young Nigerian, it's amazing to see young people really standing up and saying enough is enough. We're not going to have this anymore. We want a Nigeria where we can feel safe, and the people who are in place to protect us also make us feel safe. But I also feel like this movement has brought light on policing in Nigeria, and SARS is kind of a microcosm of policing overall in Nigeria, and dare I say possibly the continent as a whole. And in doing some research, I found that several reports show that the average Nigerian police makes about $4 a day and about $1,700 a year. So do you feel like the underserved nature and the underpaid nature of the police in general has anything to do with why we see these issues that we do with SARS?
Absolutely, it does. And it's not just the Nigerian police force. It's the whole, there's a criminal maladministration in the whole system of how things run in Nigeria. I mean, doing a job of a policeman is a high-risk job in itself. And a lot of policemen have to buy their uniforms themselves. They just have to make money by any means necessary because they're not paid enough for the kind of work they do. They aren't just paid enough. So you have a situation where the ordinary citizens feel the brunt of their low wages. They tend to extort all the time. They go around in buses. They pick up young men with dreadlocks. There's a whole profiling of young Nigerians, and then they're often the victims of SARS. So it's not just a SARS problem. It has to do with the whole structure of the Nigerian police force, the training, civil and police and civilian relations. The police doesn't even remember that they're there to protect and serve the people. It's almost a master and slave relationship. And the whole SARS protest is about reforming the Nigerian police. You know, it's better for the policemen in the long run. They're not fighting with the policemen. They're just saying, look, stop killing us, stop extorting us. We understand the issues at hand. Let us address it once and for all. Address the housing situation of the policemen, address the tools they need to do their works properly, and of course, their wages. And these are some of the things in the front burner of the conversation on NSAS. Is about reforming the entire Nigerian police force.
And Paul and I, Paul, were you going to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, a thought that I had and what I found confusing when I read about this was that police brutality in other countries, for example, in the US, because this is where this also discussed at the moment, has all of these racist motives, xenophobic motives. But these don't seem to be, like you described it, don't seem to be the major driver here in Nigeria, but it sounds like a social issue, more or less.
Yeah, there are multiple layers to it. It's a social issue. And of course, the name Nigerian Police Force, people don't even use force anymore. So it's faulty. It should be the Nigerian Police Services because you're there to protect and serve. It's not a force. A force is a trained army unit that is meant to, use violence to carry out its programs. So the Nigerian Police Force, I think there are multiple layers to why they behave the way they are. Number one, it's a hangover of colonialism. They were used by the British to make the Nigerians pre-independence stay in line, to enforce their will by force. Yes. And then there's the other side, the social part of it. They have the top hierarchy. So the corruption in the Nigerian police force is top to bottom. They are not earning well, and they have targets. So the divisional police officer sends them on raids. So you just create roadblocks on the highways, do random stop and search, and then you find sometimes they plant stuff in people's cars. So they have to, it's a survival thing. They have to survive because they're being paid peanuts for the jobs they do. So it's just unfortunate that the average Nigerian, the ordinary man on the street, is often the victim of police extortion and brutality. So it's multifaceted.
Yeah, I think also what is different about the NSARS movement and the Black Lives Matter movement in the US is in Nigeria, I think a lot of people are calling for the police to be funded. The idea is give our policemen more, train them more, pay them better, give them better living conditions, give them more. Whereas in America, there's a massive move to defund the police. I think in Nigeria, there's more of a push for more funding for the police and more care for our police force.
I would also suggest in reforming the Nigerian police, because I don't think they'll be reinventing the wheel. I don't know if this can work, if we could do a copy and paste model. Because if you remember, the Georgian police used to be very corrupt. In the aftermath of the fall of the former Soviet Union, the then president, Mikhail Saakashvili, almost sacked the entire police force. And then they had to go through, he got rid of the rogue officers, they needed to reapply, and there was training. There are lots of papers that have been published about police reform in Georgia and Eastern Europe. So the Nigerian police force might have to go through that sort of cleansing, because the corruption is almost endemic. And there are those, I remember when I used to work on radio, and we'll talk about the Nigerian police. There are people that will call in and say, if you increase their salary, if you give them more money, they wouldn't change. So we also need to look at the training process. How long do they train for? What's the quality of the training they get? Do they realize that ordinary Nigerians are citizens and they have human rights? They should be respected and they should be treated with dignity. These are conversations we need to have.
Yeah. I think also in line with that, something that I found is I was watching the judicial commissions on the SARS, and people were coming and giving their testimonies. And something that I found was really interesting was the lack of checks, and maybe not interesting, but that was really kind of alarming, was the lack of checks and balances that is in place. So often victims get in encounters with SARS, and they suffer torture or rape or things like this, and they take these matters to court, and they end up getting a judgment, compensation in some way. There was a man who spoke, and he was given 10 million naira compensation, but there's no way to exercise that. There's no way to exercise that court order. There's no one to be held accountable for it. And I feel like that's kind of a massive issue. If there's a lack of accountability, then the police can go on doing what they want to do and nothing will ever change.
Absolutely. And the testimonies of people saying, SARS officers will tell you that I will shoot you and nothing will happen. And that has happened. If you check out the website, endsars.com, a lot of people give their testimonies about their experiences in the hands of SARS. And that impunity that you rightly mentioned, Tima, is one of the biggest problems. It's like a rogue, it's a license, it's the state armed robbery squad, state-sanctioned criminals in uniform that just go around extorting young Nigerians. But because they know that there are no consequences for their bad behavior, this is what is happening. So for 2 weeks, when the protest happened, for 12 to 13 days, while the NSAS protest happened, not one single rogue SARS officer, not one, has been charged to court. Not one has resigned. Not one person has been arrested. Not one of those SARS, in spite of all the evidence, in spite of all the testimonies that have been out. So that just tells you the level of impunity that exists in our society here.
And perhaps maybe that's why the End SARS movement has now merged into the hashtag End Bad Governance, right? Because the two are so intertwined.
Absolutely.
Could I just add a question for somebody who is more at the outside of this? You were mentioning a commission of inquiry. That's probably a government commission. So the problem is well known to the government, but then there's a problem with the implementation, and there might be reparations, but then you cannot execute those orders. Because I was wondering, I saw one reaction. I think it was the president of the House of Commons in Nigeria, who basically said that he would not go through with the 2021 budget of Nigeria if the victims of violence were not compensated. But then even at that level, it would only be for compensation, but not for accountability within the police forces.
Yeah, a lot of it is, Astrid, thanks for your question. That was the Speaker of the Nigerian House of Representatives, the lower house, Mr. Gbenga. He's also a member of the ruling party, and there's a huge trust deficit between the people and the government. So a lot of people will consider that lip service. So because the government has a way of making promises and never fulfilling those promises. Yes, in Mr. President's speech, the Lagos State government, the Lagos State governor went to the president and presented the 7-point agenda of the NSAS protesters, that this is what they want. Part of it was, accountability, justice, reparation, restitution, rather, for crimes against the people. And so the president gave a directive that state governors should form independent panels of inquiry. Lagos State started its own earlier this week, and testimonies are taken and notes are taken, and then there's the lawyers there and what have you, and the Lagos State panel of inquiry is also televised. At the end of that inquiry, their findings will be presented to the president, and hopefully they will follow through on its recommendations and justice will be served.
Yeah, I think this leads us into kind of talking about how the Nigerian government has responded to these protests. And
one question, sorry to interrupt you, Tima. We have one question on YouTube. A viewer is asking, does the police force target specific groups of people, or are they just generally engaging in police brutality and raids? So this is a question to you, Gbenga, probably.
Sorry, I didn't get that question. Could you repeat?
So if there are specific groups targeted, or if it's just general violence?
It's often flashy, it's often young Nigerians, but it's not always young Nigerians. It's just random. So the only thing that immunes you, that grants you immunity from police brutality in Nigeria is if you're a member of the upper class, economic class and political class, because you would probably have a police escort, a security detail, so they won't touch you because you're VIP. But the rest, other people are fair game. I had a retired colonel give a testimony about his experience in the hands of SARS, and they were rude, they're not trained properly, so it's bigger than that. It's not so everyone is fair game. Is most of the incidents, most of this people's encounter with SARS officers happen in the southern part of Nigeria, and the north doesn't really experience SARS brutality, but of course they're still victims of the Nigerian police force in general. So the only thing that immunes you from SARS targeting you is you better be very rich, you better have a recognizable face. If you're a celebrity, if you're a top government official, if you're a VIP, then yeah, you will likely not be harassed by SARS.
Okay, so in terms of the government's response to the protests, right? A lot of reports, and of course, we all agree that the government has really responded negatively, and there are definitely things that they could have done better. But I would like us to talk about the things that happened on the 20th of October, what's now being called the Lekki Massacre. So Gbenga, can you talk us through kind of what happened on that day and how the government was involved in this?
Okay, the protests had been going on for 12 consecutive days. I happened to be at the protest ground at least 6 times, covering the events for News Central, the TV station where I work. And I had never seen anything like that in Nigeria. It was well organized. Not a single tire was burnt. I was even telling my colleagues that, this has to be the gold standard for protests, because when in France, the yellow vest, in George Floyd, the protest that happened, we've seen police use tear gas, we've seen people riot, we've seen looting, we've seen water cannons. We had not seen any of that in 12 days. These young Nigerians organized, they provided food, there was water, there were ambulance services, there was a crowdfunding, and it was transparent. It was nothing like I've never seen before. So up until that point, they were doing what was constitutionally legal for them to do. Everybody has a right to protest. And then on that Tuesday, 20th of October, the government announced a curfew at about noon, a 4 o'clock curfew. Lagos is a city of 22 million. How do you expect people to get back to their homes? They hadn't even stocked up on supplies. How do you expect them to stock up in 4 hours? So there was an extension when the government realized, maybe 4 o'clock is too early. They extended to 9. At about 7:30, we now know, because the details are open, they denied it at first, men of the Nigerian army came to the protest ground, the most peaceful protest ground. Because before then, let me just give you a background to that. Before then, there were pockets of violence breaking out in parts of Lagos. A police station was burnt. Policemen were lynched. There was a prison break in Benin City. That's about 300 kilometers away from Lagos. They did not send soldiers to those places where this incident that needed police presence and, you know, security operatives to handle. They didn't send them there. They sent them to the toll plaza, the gold standard of protest, where they've been peaceful, where they've been very organized, where there's been not a single incident of violence. The people were singing the national anthem, they were waving the Nigerian flag. And about 7:30, men of the Nigerian army came, opened fire. Some people died, and the crowd dispersed. So the aftermath of that was that, I mean, people, it was hashtag genocide was trending. Some people called it a massacre. The government, the state government, denied that it sent forces there to, you know, to shoot at protesters. And then the army denied. The army said, you know, the videos were doctored, that the army just put on the social media. It's verified, the Nigerian army's verified social media page, that, you know, it's fake soldiers. And then as the days went by, the president addressed the country. He didn't even mention the Lekki incident. It was so aloof. There were veiled threats. He also said the international community should understand and get a clearer picture before they interfere in domestic affairs of Nigerians. So, but as at today, what we know is the army has come out to say, you know, we've sent soldiers there, but they didn't, the instruction wasn't to kill. So I'm wondering, why do you even send them there before the expiration of the curfew? What was the rule of engagement? What were the rules of engagement and all of that? So we've seen a lot of, and this is why people protested. And this is why when the president said it's ended SARS and they changed the name to SWAT, the people kept on protesting, because there's a huge trust deficit between the people and the government. And we've seen government in action by their lies and then coming back and then, you know, this back and forth. So that's the situation.
Yeah, and I think also for people, it's difficult to believe that the army wasn't sent there to shoot and kill people, because if people who don't know, Lekki Tollgate is like, has a massive kind of billboard thing on top of it, and there are lights everywhere. And before this happened, all the lights were switched off, and there's images of CCTV cameras around the tollgate being taken down. So it's kind of like, it looks like it was premeditated, like there was a preemptive plan to send the army there to do what they did.
And we hope at the end of the day, for the sake of justice, that something good comes out of this. But from the feelers we're getting, it doesn't seem like it, because the people Nigerians elected to represent them, they're disconnected from the reality on the ground. They think it's just a bunch of young people causing trouble. There was a live broadcast of the Lagos State House of Assembly deliberations. You had comments like, yeah, it's because of social media. It's because they were feeding the protesters. That's why it degenerated into all that violence, chaos, and looting that we saw. Nobody talked about the root cause. Why are people protesting, or addressing the reasons, or talking about police reform? So there are lots of angry Nigerians on social media, and they're basically tired of the political class.
Okay, so I think this leads us now to getting some insight from you, Astrid, on international criminal law, and whether, you know, the things that you've heard could amount to crimes against humanity, and what the role is of the international community, international institutions, and specifically the ICC in matters like this.
Yes. I mean, there were quite strong international reactions to what has happened. In particular, the police violence was named explicitly, the killings You have, at least internationally, there was a lot of media coverage, responses by the United Nations, by the African Union, by the European Union, but it's basically also of particular states. But basically at this moment, it's condemnation of the violence. And I think in your invitation, you also referred to a tweet that was sent by the International Criminal Court, a statement by the prosecutor of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda, that she's monitoring the situation in Nigeria, and that she calls for restraint and calm. So these statements are all at a very early stage of international response, which I think, at least at this stage, is probably accurate, because in international law, you have the principle of non-intervention that is valid for the United Nations as an organization, but also for other states. So it's still in a process of monitoring and seeing where this might lead to. That doesn't mean that there was no violence going on, or that human rights of Nigerians were not violated by the violent shootings of peaceful protesters. But that means that we are not yet at a stage where an international response is necessarily prompted. And that is a very general statement for international law and international relations, and that even gets a little bit more restrictive when we talk about international criminal law and the ICC. So from what I understand, what has been going on, the current issues are is violence, police violence against protesters. We have, I'm not sure whether I got this accurately, but there's more than 50 persons that have been shot, if I understand correctly. Something in that numbers. So one of the crimes that might be involved could be crimes against humanity. Certainly murder is one of the acts that falls within the definition of crimes against humanity. What we need in addition is a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population, in the context of which such shootings or murders are taking place. So since there have been various demonstrations in various parts of the country, one could argue that this, and there have been incidents in different places, one might argue that this is getting close to a widespread attack against the civilian population. With regard to systematic, one would need to see a little bit in more detail whether this really came bottom down as an order.
If there was an order, yeah.
For instance, or whether there were plans to violently react to protests, or whether it was single policemen on the ground that used excessive violence. Yeah? But certainly with regards to widespread, if you have various locations, and this is also going on over a certain period of time, as it was in this case, one could go in the direction of crimes against humanity. But maybe in this regard, I should bring an example from the practice of the International Criminal Court. The ICC is currently looking into events in Ukraine, in various areas of the country, and one would be the shootings at Maidan Square, where also protesters were being shot by the police. Yes. I think they had around 130 casualties, people that were murdered and shot. And there's still a discussion whether this is really enough as in terms of numbers. On the other side, Maidan was a very compact event. It was only a few days, and now in Nigeria we're facing 2 weeks with multiple occasions. Yeah, so we don't have. I cannot just say, well, this is clearly crimes against humanity. We're still in a situation where something we might go in that direction. It could maybe already be argued by persons that are looking at the human rights aspects and want the broad application of the crime. There are also counter arguments against this, and I wouldn't. We don't have a comparable judgment of an international court or tribunal that would clearly say, well, from this point on, it is crimes against humanity.
Now,
but certainly things are being monitored.
Okay.
Sorry, Astrid, I would like to come in here. A lot of people have argued that, the courts take their time and the response time to incidents like this is slow. There are Nigerians that have been calling for a visa ban on the members of the ruling elite as a way of saying, you can't get away with this level of impunity. There are international laws that you violated when you sent soldiers to open fire on innocent civilians, that there should be consequences. And we've seen presidents of the International Criminal Court, we've seen people sentenced after we had Laurent Gbagbo, we had John Bosco and Katanga and other people that have been, Slobodan Milosevic, that have been held in The Hague. This comes after they've killed people for a long time. Can't there be a rapid intervention mechanism or something just to, to put fear in the hand, in the minds of these leaders that you can't go on with this? What often happens, and what we see, is all the violence happens and then the wheels of justice grind slow, and some of them are arrested and charged.
Yeah. Sorry. That's certainly true. So the international community is not acting rapidly, usually, in terms of strong enforcement. So when I read the statements that were being issued, I already thought these are very clear. They use a very clear language. It's very clear, not only saying that there was violence, but strongly also condemning the violence, and partly also blaming the military and officials for those violations of human rights. There is no rapid response mechanism, at least from a criminal law point of view. The statement by the prosecutor is, and I don't know whether I should defer much from that, but in the last week or in the last weeks, there have been several press releases from the International Criminal Court on pre-election violence, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, for instance. There was no official press release with regards to Nigeria. So I'm wondering, are we already in a time where a tweet corresponds to an official press release, or not yet? So I don't know whether there's still a level in between a tweet and an official press release. I don't know, but maybe it's the same. So certainly we have this statement. It's in the line of what we sometimes call the deterrent effect of international criminal law and the International Criminal Court, meaning that we do have a pre-existing organization. Nigeria is a state party to the ICC. They have been actually one of the founding states. They were one of the 60 states that ratified the statute necessary to have the statute coming in, entering into force. So the ICC would certainly have jurisdiction over these events. But we are not even yet in the very early stage of talking about preliminary examinations. It's still the language of monitoring and also seeing what happens. And that's certainly, I mean, I am a scholar in international criminal law, and I think it's a very relevant tool in the international rule-based order. But what we need to admit is that international criminal law always comes after the events, yes. Particularly international criminal law, because we do need a certain threshold. We can't go after every murder that occurs. This is not the aim, and also of international criminal law, and also the definitions are drafted in a way that you cannot apply them to any incidents. So we already need a certain level of violence before international criminal law comes into place. So that's unfortunate, but with regard to international criminal law, that's just a fact. Also the idea of criminal law being the ultima ratio, coming only when no other means are available. But certainly we have other institutions, organs of the United Nations, for instance, treaty bodies that also deal with human rights violations that may not amount to crimes or crimes against
Now,
humanity.
Astrid, who brings the cases forward to the International Criminal Court? Are petitions sent? How does it work?
Yes, so there are three possibilities how a situation can go to the International Criminal Court. One would be a referral by the Security Council. That's, I think, at the current point in time, globally, politically, rather not really an option, with the veto powers in the Security Council and at least one permanent member not being very fond of the activities of the International Criminal Court. We could have a state referral. That could mean that either Nigeria itself believes that they cannot cope with this violence and provide accountability, and they could ask the International Criminal Court to intervene. It would be a self-referral. We had several self-referrals in the context of African situation, Uganda, the DRC, Central African Republic. It could also be other states that refer the situation to the International Criminal Court. This is something that has not been used very frequently in the past. It's always a lot of political will that a country needs to bring up to kind of blame another country for violations. It has recently been done with regards to the situation in Venezuela, where other South American countries also, in combination with Canada, refer the situation. The most likely, I assume, in the context of Nigeria, would be a proprio motu investigation of the prosecutor. The prosecutor, we call it communications. So she receives information that possibly alleged crimes that fall within the jurisdiction of the court have been committed. In the context of Nigeria, this has already been done. She says that she had already received several communications. And then it is within the power of the prosecutor to review this information, see how serious it is, and decide whether to go on with an investigation. Although this process of coming to an investigation has been very much formalized at the International Criminal Court, it's being put in the context of what is called a preliminary examination. And this is not just reviewing some evidence, because the standard of proof is not very high to open an investigation. And she would need to ask the pretrial chamber. There's kind of a judicial balance, checks and balance here of the independence of the prosecutor. So the level is not so high, but nevertheless, the examination is very thorough. So she would look into the jurisdiction, whether crimes within the jurisdiction of the court have been committed, whether all the other jurisdictional elements would be there, which would not be a problem with regard to Nigeria, because it is a state party. And then she would also need to examine the question of admissibility. And that means we have two prongs of admissibility. One would be the question whether Nigeria is actually investigating those cases. That would be the context of complementarity, or whether they're in the process of investigating cases. So that's why I was also asking with regard to the investigation commissions, because what we usually would be looking for would be criminal investigations and criminal trials. But there is some some leeway that the prosecutor has, even under the Rome Statute, whether certain investigations might be enough. If you think back of South Africa, the Truth Commission.
Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Exactly. Yeah. So they were not judicial proceedings, but at least there was the threat if a perpetrator would not tell the whole truth, he could afterwards be tried before a criminal court. So that was this was of course before the times of the of the ICC, but this was sometimes argued that this might be enough. This should be accepted as a country's way to deal even with mass atrocities. But just a truth commission that just establishes what has happened might not be enough. And then it's the question of the prosecutor, whether she thinks this is enough in terms of the Rome Statute, or whether in her independence, she decides to maybe not proceed immediately to see what is coming out of this process. And the other prong that we have with regard to admissibility is the one of gravity, which sounds strange at first sight, because if we establish an international criminal court for the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole, one wonders why there's any gravity issues with any of the crimes that falls within the jurisdiction of the court. But so far, gravity has been more seen as something, well, usually it's there if not special circumstances would suggest that a situation is not grave enough. But with
Astrid, when you, sorry to interrupt you, when you talk about gravity, is it in the numbers of casualty or the means at which the violence was carried out?
Or is it the nature of the crime? Like if it's a crime against humanity, is it?
It can't really be the nature of the crime, because the nature of the crime is per se grave.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now we only have grave crimes there. But for instance, with regard to war crimes, we have a huge list of war crimes that goes from murdering to declaring that no quarter can be given. That's just a declaration. Yeah.
Bombing hospitals. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a level of gravity maybe among some of the crimes, but here we are talking about murder. So the crime as such, I think there's no question of the gravity. So it's not only the numbers, it has been a number play for a very long time, but that doesn't mean that if the numbers are not so high, that the intensity, maybe the people that are involved. For me, it's always also one of the aspects would be if a state is involved, state officials that should add to the gravity of the crime, because then it's usually systematic. If it's a systemic violence, this also adds. So we also have intensity that amounts to the question of gravity.
Okay, I have a question. In terms of the African Union and its role in this, does the International Criminal Court, for example, international institutions, do they first wait to see what the regional body does and then act on that, or are they completely acting independently of each other?
Yeah, we don't yet have a criminal jurisdiction of the African Union. There's a draft, the so-called Malabo Protocol, that would add a criminal chamber to the African Court of Justice and Human Rights. But I think, if I remember correctly, not one state has yet
I think 11,
ratified. Sorry?
11 have ratified so far.
Who?
11 states have ratified so far.
No, not the protocol. That adds the criminal chamber, because we had several stages of building this court. The merger, and then later on the Malabo Protocol, which was ratified by a few states, but then the Malabo Protocol was revised again to add immunity provisions, and that last revision has not yet been ratified. So at the moment, we don't have any conflict or parallel traits with regard to the African Union, but the ICC is based on the principle of complementarity, and that means that states should be the first to prosecute those crimes. It's the primary responsibility of states. So whenever something would be going on in Nigeria, the ICC would need to see if it's against the same person that the ICC is interested in prosecuting, then the national trials would be prevailing.
Okay. I think it's also important to note, because Gbenga, you talked about intervention and if international institutions can intervene. The African Union in its charter, there is a provision that gives the assembly the right to decide when to intervene in matters of genocide, crimes against humanity, things like this. But the assembly, as we know, is comprised of heads of states, African states, or their representatives. So I think often it becomes a political question as well of when to intervene and when not to intervene. At least,
and it's like an old boys club. They would hardly go against one of theirs. So it's just, yeah. It would be very generous of them to come together and say, let's intervene this this other country, because they're all guilty. A lot of them are guilty of the same crimes.
And the stakes here are very high because we're talking about military intervention, no?
Yes.
This provision of the Charter of the African Union.
Yes.
So,
Paul and I, sorry, yes.
Is there any way for an individual to petition a court or an institution on an international level in this? Because like my first instinct when I read this was in Europe there would be the European Court of Human Rights, who could be petitioned by any citizen, and then fines could be imposed on the state rather than individual rulers under international criminal law. Now, to my understanding, for the African Court on Human and People's Rights, this is different. So there isn't a mechanism for individual motions.
Yeah, my understanding is that when it comes to the African Court of Human and People's Rights, it either has to be an NGO or some sort of organization that petitions. I'm not 100% sure if individuals have the ability to do that. Astrid, are you aware of this?
Yeah, I'm not completely sure. I had the impression there was something like an individual complaint mechanism in a protocol, but not many states have ratified it, but I could be mistaken. I could mix it up with NGOs acting for an individual. So I'm not completely sure. I'm sorry.
But in the case of Europe, where individuals can, make a case against a state, how does the court deal with it? Because if you do it in Africa, you'll be inundated with cases on a daily basis, and it might overwhelm the system. So how does the European Court of Justice, how have they been able to handle that problem, if I may use that word?
So that would be the regional human rights protection system with the European Court of Human Rights at its top. Well, there are some protection against a high case load. It's, for instance, that of course, first of all, the national instances must have been used. There must be a final judgment. You need to go to our constitutional court, for instance, if possible, and only then a case could be admissible. They've also instituted other safeguards. For instance, we had very similar applications from certain states, for instance, conditions in prisons, the length of judicial proceedings, and there would be more restrictive in the selection of cases where they had already established that a state had violated the Human Rights Convention with that regard. So there's an increasing amount of cases also at the European system. The judges have tried to be dealing with that, and so far I think it's working.
Okay. Well, thanks, Astrid, for giving us insight onto the legal aspect. I think the final point that we really wanted to talk about was the impact of this movement on Africa at large. So right now we see that the End SARS movement is not the only youth-led, social, decentralized movement that's taking place on the continent. We have movements in South Africa, in Ethiopia, in Cameroon. We have movements in Congo, like Gbenga was saying earlier on. So this is a much bigger issue than SARS and Nigeria. So, I mean, Gbenga, what do you think about the impact of these youth-led movements in Africa? And are we at the point of a new dawn, as some would say?
Yes, we're absolutely at the point of a new dawn. There's a huge political awakening in Nigeria. And the big question is, can it be sustained until 2023, where this can be translated into political power? Because but we've seen something unprecedented, and there's the hashtag Congo is bleeding. There are issues in Cameroon, in Namibia, in South Africa, and different parts of the continent. Let's not forget that Africa is the youngest continent in the world. There's a huge amount of young people now, and this let me speak for Nigeria. Now that we have a generation that knows that, look, we're armed with the tools of social media. You can't bully us. We're educated. We're tech savvy. We would hold government accountable. It's a new awakening. It's a new awakening, and I believe it's going to translate into better accountability and improve the quality of governance in general, because we've seen what they can do, and it's organic. It wasn't like a individual led protest, as opposed to in the past we always used to see the Nigerian Labour Congress lead protests against the increase in pump fuel of price, and then at 3 o'clock in the morning after negotiations with the government, they call off the strike, and that's it. Everybody dissipates. That's the end. But we saw a leaderless movement. It was almost like a blockchain. It was organic, and I think that's what sustained it for that long. And you can't compromise any leader. The Nigerian youth said, look, these are our demands, meet those demands, and when we see that you're really working towards changing the situation, or you've addressed our concerns, we would leave the streets. So it's, if I was the government, rather than trying to muzzle them more, because we have a huge problem. I mean, it needs to be of national security concern, because we saw the looting and the violence that took place after that. I mean, we're still feeling the aftershocks of that. There's a huge problem with unemployment. They need to look at it, and this is for national security and also regional security issues, because if Nigeria implodes, I don't think the whole of West Africa will be able to handle the fallout, the blowback from that in terms of refugees and all. And Nigeria is the engine room of Africa, so it's important for Nigeria to work in order for Africa to progress.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think also the diaspora, those of us Nigerians living outside of the continent or outside of the country, I feel like the reason that this movement has blown up so much and become so international is because of the other protests that happened in London, and because of the protests that happened in South Africa and and in the US and in other parts of the world. So I think it's time for us as a collective, as an African collective, to understand that we do have strength in numbers, and those of us outside
Absolutely.
of the continent need to care about what's going on at home, and we need to use our influence in the spaces that we're in to make sure that African voices are heard all over the world.
Just to piggyback on your point about the Nigerian diaspora, remittance from the Nigerian diaspora was $19 billion last year. They're a huge number, and they're in different parts of the world, and they also helped galvanize and amplify the End SARS movement. So they've put the government on notice. I mean, you can gag people in Nigeria. If you shut down the social media space in Nigeria, it doesn't mean that the army of Nigerians outside will not talk. And their voice is very important too, because they're Nigerians. They just happen to be outside. So it's changed the dynamics, and we have a more democratized space for speaking. Traditional media in the past would not. Even the broadcast regulators, I forgot to add this, NBC fined a couple of stations because they did what they're meant to do constitutionally, report on issues of national importance. They sent a circular to stations saying, your reporting shouldn't embarrass the government and this. And the national broadcaster didn't even pay so much attention to what was going on ground. So we also need to.
Oh, I think we've lost Gbenga.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that essentially.
Can I have a word?
Yes, of course.
No, just from an international law point of view, that if change occurs and we have a movement that is cross-African countries for better government, democracy, better inclusion of all parts of the population, that I wish that this might be very well observed, particularly reaction of governments in place, monitored by the international community, and also that there will be strong statements and if such protests are continued to be met with violence. And hopefully not, but if yes, that we do have strong international reactions to that.
Yes, I agree. I mean, we've seen it in the US, for example, with Joe Biden coming forward and making a statement, and MPs in Parliament in the UK. And I feel like that has a lot to do with the diaspora coming together and really demanding that our representatives outside of Nigeria hold our governments accountable. Yeah, so we wanted to end off with kind of letting people know what they can do moving forward, where they can donate, and things that they can do to help the movement. So you can donate to the End SARS Response, which is kind of a medical fund that's crowdfunding and collecting money for people who were hurt during the 20th of October aequi Massacre. There's also a legal aid network that you can donate to, and there's a memorial fund for people who lost their lives during the massacre. So we'll try to include some of the links in the description at the end of the live video. And yeah, at the end of the day, we think it's important to continue to talk about things that are going on outside. Even if they're outside of our borders, we think it's important to continue to amplify voices and to hold governments accountable where they need to be held accountable.
Yeah, and we hope that we could have added to this today with this podcast. Thank you, Astrid. Thank you also, Gbenga, who now apparently lost the connection, for joining us and for discussing this with us for this really interesting episode and giving us this input. Also, thank you to all of our viewers and our listeners for joining us here, either live or viewing this afterwards. We will be back with a new episode in our normal, usual, standard format and setting and topics in 2 weeks, where we're also very excited now about this, about our new topic. Thank you again for joining us, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.